Orlan told me a story of a friend of his who died of AIDS, and Orlan had told him a story about a crow who was insatiably hungry and went around eating everything, absolutely everything, but then stopped and looked into the stream, and its reflection came up and ate it.
Whoa.
And Orlan's friend, this is a man who had addictions and needle drug. And Orlan went to see him like 3 days before he died. And the man thanked him for that story and said, "That's my life." And sometimes it takes a while to see your own story in these other stories. I tell these Coyote Stories to my students at Kenyon College. These are 18, 19-year-old kids, and so they hear the story about Coyote. There's a bush that says, "Don't eat me. Anybody eats me will shit in mountains." And so Coyote says, "Well, that can't apply to me. I'm going to eat that bush." And then, of course, ends up on this big, huge pile of shit. And my students all think, "Well, that doesn't apply to us." And then you see on Saturday night. So, you can tell them the story, but they say, "That doesn't, it's an interesting Coyote story. It doesn't apply to me." And, what I want to do, but it'll take me a little time, is I'm going to just tell 2 stories the days during this week. And the second one is this story about Hermes and stealing his brother's cattle and so forth. There's a wonderful line of Eliade, he's a person like Campbell who thought a lot about myth. Eliade says the myths think each other. So one story it's as if one story is thinking about another story. And so for me, what's useful is to get a couple of stories going and begin to see how they think one another. And so the Hermes story tells me something about the Raven story. So I do want to get to it, but and so maybe what I'll do is we'll spend a little more time on this Raven story, and for a time I'll get to Hermes and not say much about it today, and we'll go on. So in the North Pacific coast, the Raven is a trickster figure, and it's from before the new people came, and when there were still monsters eating everything, and before there was daylight. And in those days, the animals lived in tribes on the Queen Charlotte Islands. And there was a tribe of animals, the great chief and his wife, and they had a son who they loved very much. And the father tried to keep this boy from all harm. And in the back of the great lodge where he lived, he built him a bed high up. The boy slept up there above his parents every night. And the father washed him 2 or 3 times a day. And he grew up. But when he got quite large, he got sick. And in a couple of days, he died. And so the chief and his wife were grief-stricken. And the chief ordered his people to lay out the body of his boy in the lodge. And then he ordered them to cut him open and take out his intestines and burn the intestines at the back of the lodge. And the chief and his wife could not get over their grief. And so the whole village mourned regularly, day after day after day, for months. And one day the chieftainess got up early, and she saw a light, bright light, coming from this bed at the back. And she climbed up the ladder, and there was a shining youth giving off light. She said, "Are you my son?" He said, "Yes." So they were quite happy. She called her husband. "He's back." And they called the village, and the villagers were overjoyed. And this shining youth said, "Heaven was annoyed with your constant grieving, so they sent me back down." This chief and his wife had 2 great slaves, a miserable man and woman. Their names were Mouth at Each End. The job of these great slaves, named Mouth at Each End, was to bring the food into the house. Every day in the morning, they would bring all kinds of food into the house. They would go out early. Typically, they would come back with a big hunk of whale meat, whale fat, and they would throw that fat in the fire, and then they would eat it. The one odd thing about the boy, the shining prince, was he actually didn't eat very much. Oh, occasionally he would chew on a piece of fat, but then he'd spit it out. And his mother was quite worried about him, because she was afraid if he didn't eat, he would die again. In fact, one day, the father climbed up the ladder and looked in the bed when the shining prince was out for a walk. He looked in the bed, and there was the corpse of his own son. But still, he loved this new boy. But he wouldn't eat, so they were worried about him. So one day when the chief and his wife were away, the shining prince, he got into a conversation with the two great slaves, and he mouthed at each end. He says, how come you eat all the time? He said, oh, we're hungry all the time. He said, well, do you like to eat? Oh, yeah, we like that. Does it taste good what you eat? Oh, yeah, we like it to eat. He says, well, why are you hungry all the time? They said, we are hungry because we have eaten the scabs from our shin bones. The boy said, is that good? Oh, yeah, we like to eat those scabs. He says, well, I'd like to try that. The woman says, no, you don't want to try that. Don't eat that. He says, no, I'll just taste it and spit it out. I won't actually eat it. So the man, slave, he takes one of these scabs and he puts it in a piece of whale meat.
In a piece of whale meat?
Yeah. And the youth chews on it a bit and spits it out. So after a little while, his mother comes home. He says, Ma, I am ravenous. I am very hungry. She's delighted. She says, wonderful. She bakes him this huge meal. He eats the entire meal, puts down his fork. He says, Mother, I am ravenous. So she has the slaves make him another huge meal. He eats that meal. He says, I'm still hungry. I make him another meal. So he continues to eat until he has eaten everything in the house. Then he goes out on the street, and he goes from house to house, eating everything in each of the houses. And he says, where are the storehouses where you keep the winter stuff? And they say, well, and at the end of this, he says, I'll be down there eating. And the father is kind of upset about this. He is sad and ashamed of this incredible appetite that his boy has. And so he calls him back to the main lodge, and he takes him to the back where that bed is, and he sits him down, and he says, this won't do, this hunger you have, and so I've decided to send you away. You're going to go to the mainland. And here are 3 things for you to take with you. One is a blanket made of raven feathers. And you put this on, and you will become the raven and be able to fly toward the mainland. And one is a stone. If you get tired as you're flying, just drop that stone. It'll turn into an island, and you can go down and rest. And the third is a sea lion bladder. And inside of this is the salmon roe, and the trout roe, and the berry seeds. And when you get to the mainland, you throw the salmon roe into the rivers, and the trout roe into the rivers, and the berry seeds all over. And for the rest of time, there will be fish in the streams and berries on the bushes, so that you will be able to eat year after year. And so the boy puts on the blanket of raven feathers, and he flies to the mainland, and he tears open that sea lion bladder, and he scatters all those seeds. So this is the beginning of the raven cycle. This is a long, long story. So I don't know, what I wanted to do was kind of chew on this story for a while, as if it were a shin scab. And so I wanted to say just a couple things about the raven story again. I want to think a bit about praising the father at the front of this story. Mm-hmm. And a couple things to say is, one is, the father does not kill this boy. He just gets sick and dies. And what the father does is after his death. At some level, it doesn't feel right entirely to criticize the father's impulse to keep the child from all harm, because that's a strong impulse in a father. And somebody pointed out to me, she said, that's the same story as the Buddha. The Buddha's father tried to keep the Buddha from all harm. The Buddha was the son of a rich man, and he said, well, I just never want my son to see any sick people, any dying people, and so forth. And so the kid was like 20 years old before he saw this stuff. There's a chain here that is almost like the beginning of spiritual life, is to begin with that demand that we would like to protect each other. And then, of course, it has to fail. and then something deeper happens. So I respect the father's desire to protect the child. And I also think that there may be a germ of some kind of sacrifice in this business about the intestines. And I'll say more about that when we get to Hermes, but if the problem is somehow being ridden by appetite makes you vulnerable, to cut out the intestines is an attempt to have a different relationship to appetite. And even in that, there may be something valuable. Almost unintentionally, the organs of appetite are sacrificed. And through that sacrifice, this character becomes a being who is more like we are and less driven by the organs of appetite. So there's a theme about the sacrifice of the organs of appetite. Carl Jung says the trickster is a precursor of the savior. And I wonder sometimes if he's not doing it consciously, but still there's the need to do that is there. So because Robert pestered me a bit about this, I thought I'd say one or two more things about Raven and tell one more image that's later in the Raven cycle. I want to come back first to this idea that along with appetite comes an intelligence about making a trap so that you can feed yourself, and an intelligence about how to get out of the trap if something else is trying to eat you. And that there is then a kind of predator-prey relationship in a lot of these early trickster stories. It's all about eating and animals that are trying to outwit one another. I read this whole book about people trying to think about how intelligence might have evolved, and the one thing that was most interesting to me in this book was the guy says if you look over like 100 million years at herbivores who graze on the grasses and carnivores who come and eat the herbivores, you see a slow increase of intelligence on both sides. And he says if you, what they do is they take sort of brain size as a rough measure of how smart the beast is. And they say if you go back 100 million years, you put this on a chart, say 1 to 10, how smart are you as a herbivore or carnivore? You go back 100 million years and the carnivores are a little smarter than the herbivores. They're like at a 2 and the herbivore is down here at 0, and so they can eat them. But then 30 million years later, the herbivores have gone up to 4. Unfortunately, the carnivores have gone up to 5. And then you go 30 million years later, and the herbivores are up to 7. Unfortunately, the carnivores are up to 8 now. And it's as if this tension between the predator and the prey is a great engine on intelligence. That each one has to wise up. And it takes only 30 million years to get a little smarter.
Not bad.
No.
So what, did the dinosaurs refuse to move up a notch?
Yeah.
What did he say?
Yeah, the dinosaurs refused to move up. Yeah. The dinosaurs got tenure, and that was it. So what interests me there's a theme in the trickster, so part of that is in the trickster story about predator-prey and intelligence about traps and trapping other things and stuff. But I think there's like a third position that begins to emerge in this story, and I began to get to it yesterday with that little image of the coyote who takes a shit on the trap, because that's a more complicated relationship to the trap. It's as if the hunter, there's man, and he's trapping some rabbits or something. There is a predator-prey relationship, but the trickster character is a little bit to the side and is watching the trap and watching what these other two guys are doing. And I'll give you a couple other examples that are actually in these stories. There's a Zulu, South African trickster named Flakanyana, who is a kind of weasel character. And the story there is if you are a hunter and you have set a trap, a baited trap out in the woods, Flakanyana will come and steal the bait. And then they say, if you're that hunter and the trickster has stolen the bait out of your trap, And you pretty much have to get rid of that trap because it probably won't work much anymore. It's not a very good trap. I love this image of the bait thief, the one who can steal the bait. It's like, well, actually, I'll go to Raven now because the same thing is in the Raven cycle. There's a one little incident where Raven comes into the lodge where they're eating fish, and he says, well, how do you catch those fish? They say, well, we have these hooks, and we put fat on the hooks, and they show Raven how to do it. We just put the fat on the hook, and we throw that in the water, and the fish come, and then we catch the fish. And so Raven understands it, and then what he does when the fishermen are fishing is he dives underwater, and he takes the fat off the hook. And so when they pull it up, they got no fish and no bait. And again, I love that it's the bait thief. And remember I said the earliest, this old Greek word, dolos, is the word for trick in Greek, and it's the baited hook. So there's a kind of oppositional thing going on in the universe between these predators and prey. It's a duality. There's a sort of boundary between them. And sometimes in the Trickster stories, what you find is a character who comes in and finds the third position. So one relationship is to get into a fight and a battle and so forth with those characters, but the Trickster is some other kind of cunning, which manages to get fed without getting killed by the hidden hook that's in there.
But he goes around. He's out like the polarity, right? He's like the third mystery power that doesn't belong to the predator or the prey.
Yeah.
He can be either predator or will be prey. It's like that sacred element that you don't know how, the catalyst almost in some way.
Yeah.
Like a neutron, huh?
Yeah, exactly like a neutron.
He isn't set. He combines the two. Right. As Miguel said, he moves back and forth. He occupies all three positions.
Yeah. And one thing about it is he does not give up eating. So that's some other mythology. There may be other characters who try to give up eating, but the Trickster character figures out how to eat without getting caught, without getting hooked.
That's right.
Doesn't he? He's eaten and killed and springs back to life on a regular basis.
Yeah. Though you see, I partly feel that in a lot of the Coyote stories, he gets killed and he's too stupid to see what's going on. But partly what I see is the stories are about a kind of slowly increasing intelligence. Every time he gets killed, he has to. It's like a short version of this 100-million-year story. Every time he gets fucked up because of his desire for food, he has to wise up a little bit. And in that potentially is this intelligence that then you see sometimes in these small incidents of the trickster who knows how to steal the bait and avoid the hook. And I mean, we have that in our language. Talk about getting hooked. I'm hooked on whatever it is. William Burroughs used to say, well, I may have a heroin habit, but the rest of the country has a matter habit. Everybody wants to, they're hooked on cars or commodities or television or clean clothes or something. I mean, there are all these hooks out there.
And he was the son of Burroughs' adding machine.
Yeah, his father had been hooked in a different way.
Yeah.
And
Burroughs adding machine.
Adding machine, great adding machine company.
And they turned into a computer company.
Yeah.
that's why he could afford to be a beatnik. It was hard to finance the beatnik generation. Burroughs had an inherited fortune, and Kerouac's mother financed the rest of them. Well, is there more? We've sort of had that story around for a while.
I'd like to just add a little detail. I have a friend from Norway, and he spent time in far north of Norway. And he said that there he found that the ravens actually did learn how to do that. The ice fishermen would put a set line in the water, and the ravens would come and fly down and grab the line and pull it back out on the ice and walk forward on the fish line and hold it in place and then grab it again and keep doing that until the bait came out and they ate the bait and flew away. He saw them do it, so I believe him. That's
Thank you.
The more Norwegian.
Yes.
He's going to take the bait himself. Now.
Yeah. Would you like a footnote?
He's going to move to your house and eat out of your fridge.
Yeah.
The more Norwegian material in his book, the better it'll be.
Actually, there was a thing in the Natural History magazine about, of course, as scientists, they had to do this in a controlled way, but they put, like this thing here, if that were a piece of meat there, they put crows in a room with a piece of meat hanging like that, and the crows would fly around and hit against it and everything. And then they put the ravens in the room, and the ravens sat in the corner for about 10 minutes looking at it. and then he flew up and he walked along the string, and he took his beak and he pulled it up and ate the meat. And I mean, the animals that get picked out as carriers of this are animals that have a kind of intelligence that reminds us of ourselves.
But I was thinking about if you could think of all the animals, because in some traditions it's a spider,
Yeah.
Nancy's a spider. Nancy, Iktomi is a spider too, so they're not all coyote or raven,
Yeah.
but it's interesting how they come around. Rabbit in Guatemala is a rabbit too, is a smart, the rabbit's the real trickster, yeah.
Well, a raven too is known in Southwest as a flying coyote. And another thing in Guatemala, it's interesting you say this, is that not only do they steal these things, but they also hide them. Ravens love to hide things. And coyotes have this predilection too. And certain of the other trickster animals too, they like shiny things.
Yeah.
And they like to hold things, and they like to play with things, obviously. I mean, I've seen coyotes play with all kinds of things you wouldn't believe what they would do with them. But in Guatemala, the raven, and the coyote in particular, and there's two other animals which I won't get into, but they're also trickster animals. They, in one creation, are the only ones that save the world, because when the world is destroyed and run out of business, when the next creation comes in, there's no seeds. And because they've stolen all these seeds and hidden them someplace, there are seeds that we use now. All the pine trees and plants and everything, and they're the only ones who knows where it is. But the problem is, since it's a new creation, they can't get them. There has to be new tricksters invented. And
But that's true.
They have to ask permission.
That's true of people like Freud and Jung too. They get stuff away from the monsters and they hide them somewhere.
Exactly.
And
So
then,
that's what we do. But you do it by acting like a monster.
How does the squirrels fit in? Because they're always hiding things.
Same thing. The squirrel are a little more heroic. And so what they're opportunists. They're sort of like lawyers, They, they work for the monster slayers. They're all wounded and their bones are all broken. But then the squirrel says, well, I can get you underneath, and all you have to do is shoot him in the heart. So I'll show you how to get there and everything, and then you just give me all the stuff you get. And then the monster slayer comes back, with the scalps and everything all broken. And the squirrel says, oh, can I have everything else? Yeah, you can take it, get it. But they're trickster, but not so much trickster.
One thing I like about is that the trickster is, smart about theft and hiding things and stuff, but is not greedy. Well, in some cases.
Yeah.
In some cases. But like the Hermes always has this little sack of cash, but the point is to get trade going, to get liveliness and flow going. It's not about hoarding big piles of wealth. Mm-hmm. And the same in this, the coyote loves to steal bright things, but there's a playfulness about it. It's about playing. One thing to say, people often say, well, what is the modern trickster? And there's a lot of ways to talk about that, but one thing to say is that this figure comes out of polytheistic religions and has sacred functions, and is about keeping the cosmos alive and lively. And if you don't have that sacred function, you don't have this character. And so one answer is there are none. And when Walt Disney steals these images, they're dead. Mm-hmm. So this will be with us as part of the conversation, but I want to try to tell some of the Homeric hymn to Hermes. And there's a group of poems that were written that come from the same time as the Iliad and the Odyssey. And they were apparently sung as preludes, as the opening act. If somebody was going to sing the Iliad over a period of 3 or 4 days, these little poems would be sung as preludes to that. And so there's one to Demeter, and there's one to Hephaestus and so forth, and there's one to Hermes, and it's the main place that we know some of the story of Hermes. And so in this story, we're going to talk about Hermes, who was the son of Zeus and Maya. And Maya was a shame-faced nymph who used to hide out in her cave, and she used to avoid the company of the blessed gods. She was a kind of shy goddess. She had fabulous hair and wonderful feet. And Zeus used to come and visit her in the nighttime when sleep held white-armed Hera fast. That's the wife. So, she was asleep, and Zeus would come down to visit Maya in her cave. When his purpose had been accomplished, after 9 moons had risen, this baby was born, came up out of the darkness into the light. He didn't lie around in his mother's arms very long. He didn't lie around in that cradle very long. Almost immediately he got up and he walks out of the cave where Maya lives, and he goes into the little courtyard that's in front of that cave. The first thing that happens is that the mountain turtle has a speckled shell, and it's waddling past, eating the long grass. And Hermes bumps into it. He looks down and he sees this turtle, and he laughs. He says, "Oh, this is great. What a bit of luck. I'm going to make something very valuable out of this. What a bit of good fortune for me." And then he starts to talk to the turtle. He says, "What's a pretty girl like you doing in a place like this? Where'd you get that beautiful mountain shell? You should come inside where it's safer. It's dangerous to be out in the open air like this." So he picks her up and he takes her inside and he kills her. And he takes a scoop, he cuts off her head and her feet, and he takes a scoop of gray iron and he cleans out the shell. And he has this big shell like this. And immediately, the way a sudden moment of laughter might go through the heart of a depressed man, or the way a sexy glance might go across a room, he knew what to do and did it. So he took some materials. He took some gut from the cow, and he took these pieces of wood, and he took some twine and everything, and he put 2 side pieces on this shell, and he put a bar across the top, and he put 7 strings down like this, and he made himself this musical instrument called the lyre. And as soon as he made it, he took the original flat pick, and he took a flat pick and he went and he sat out on the rock and he tuned up the lyre and he started singing. And what he sang was the famous song of his own birth. It wasn't famous yet, he wasn't famous yet, but he was on his way. So he tunes up the lyre and he sings the song of Zeus and Maya and how he came to be born. That detail always reminds me of Walt Whitman. When Whitman first wrote Leaves of Grass, of course, nobody knew who he was. And so Whitman wrote 2 or 3 book reviews and placed them strategically in certain magazines. And the trouble is, if you're the new guy in town, who is going to sing your song? And you may have to do it yourself. So Hermes sings his own song at the beginning. Also, one thing that's going on there is, if you imagine this song being sung by the bard at the beginning of a festival, he's standing there with the lyre singing about Hermes. And then about 20 lines in, he describes Hermes sitting there singing about Hermes. So there's a kind of, he's identifying the singer, the teller of this tale is saying, I'm a little like Hermes here, and Hermes is like me. So he sings for a while, but then his mind begins to wander because he's hungry to eat meat. And so he takes the lyre and he takes it back in where his mother has this cradle, and he puts the lyre back in the cradle. And he goes up on a rock, looks around the way sneaky people might do who are trying to plan some midnight adventure. He gets it in mind to get him some cattle and make some hamburgers. So he sees in the distance that there are these sacred meadows where the gods keep the cattle, and these are Apollo's herds. And the herds are in unmown meadows where things are always just coming into bloom and the fruit is always just coming on, ripening. And the cattle, there's a fixed number of them. They don't breed. They just kind of sit there and eat and everything. And so Hermes runs. It's now nighttime. He runs to the field. And what he does is to take 50 of these cattle and cut them out of the herd and start walking them away. And he's worried that maybe he'll be found out. So you see the kind of cunning he has about, one thing is that there's some dogs who are supposed to protect these cattle, and Hermes puts them into a lethargic stupor as he approaches the thing. And then when he takes the cattle, one thing he does to try to disguise the fact that he's stolen these is he makes the cattle walk backwards. So that if you look at the tracks, they go into the field. And the other thing he does is he makes himself a pair of sandals out of twigs of myrtle and tamarisk and stuff, and he gets all these twigs mushed together like this, and he puts them on his feet. And again, the thing is, if you look at these tracks, they don't have any direction. You can't tell which way the guy's going. There's a wonderful thing in the blues singers. There used to be a character named Crooked-Footed John, and Crooked-Foot John escapes from the prison, and he puts his shoes on backwards and runs away. And so it's the same story. And the problem is to make your footprints confuse whoever's after you. So he takes these cattle like this, and as he's going, there's one old guy up on the hillside tending his grapevine who sees Hermes passing by. This guy named Bottas. And he sees Hermes going by, and Hermes is a little worried, maybe there's witness or something. So he comes up, he says, "How you doing, old geezer?" And he says, "Oh, I'm okay." He says, "Well, you know, these grapes you're tending, they will bear a lot of wine if you just listen to me a little bit here. If anybody should come along and ask you, 'Did you see anybody on the road?' You should say no. And if they say, 'Did you hear anything?' you should say, 'No, you didn't.' And in general, keep your mouth shut." So Bottas says, "Okay, I'll do that." Then Hermes takes the cattle to a place by the river Alpheus where there's an old barn, and he gets them in there, and he beds them down and feeds them. Then he sets to work making a fire. Hermes invents the method of making fire with sticks. At this moment, you see him inventing it. He gets a stick that you can spin fast and against another stick, and he kindles the fire. And he prays to Hephaestus to help him get a good, strong fire. Then he takes, and this is a one-day-old baby, he takes 2 of the cattle out of the herd, brings them out near the fire, grabs them by the head, pulls the head back, cuts the spinal cord, throws them on the ground, cuts their hides off, throws the hides on a rock there. Still, if you go to that place, apparently you can see the mark that these hides made. He cuts the meat up into portions. And in the Greek system, there are 12 gods. And so he cuts the meat up into 12 portions. He's going to sacrifice some meat to each of the gods. One detail is that he divides these portions by lot. Instead of in some sort of hierarchical way, who gets what is decided by a little lottery. That's Hermes' private lottery. And then he roasts the meat on the grill. And the smell of it is just fabulous. And his mouth is watering, and he longs to eat this meat. And then his proud heart prevails, and he doesn't eat it. And what he does is he takes one piece of the meat, and he hangs it up in the barn as a token of this youthful theft. And then he burns everything, and then he takes the certain parts of the animal that are not cooked that way, and he throws them in a pit, and he burns them. And he hides the fire, and he throws his sandals into the river, hides everything. And then he goes back to his mother's cave. And he shows up about 4 a.m., and she's locked the door. She's heard about tough love, and she's got a whole system to try to deal with this kid. So he goes through the keyhole the way mist might on an autumn evening, and he sneaks across the floor. Unfortunately, his mother is an Olympian almost herself, and she hears him sneaking, and she comes out. My stepson used to like to go out and spray paint graffiti, so this scene, I identify strongly with this scene. He would come in at 4 a.m. and I would hear him come in. And then we would have a discussion. And so the mother, Maya, says, "You're a worthless kid." And he says, "No, I'm not. I've just been out eating, stealing and stuff." She says, "Yeah, you're a worthless kid. I hope Apollo catches you and ties you up and throws you in jail, and you're just like your father. And you've been put on Earth to be a big pest to humankind, and I don't know what I'm going to do with you." She says, "You who wear the cloak of shamelessness, you're a completely shameless person. You have no sense of dignity." So he listens to this for a while. And he says, "Well, I don't know about you, but I don't want to spend the rest of eternity living in a cave. And I feel that we should live up on Mount Olympus with the other gods. I don't know why they get heaps of grain sacrificed to them and we don't. So my agenda here is that we are going to move out of this low-rent apartment and get something much better. And I'd like you to come with me, and we will be famous, you and I. And if my father Zeus will not give me what I feel I deserve, then I will steal it, and I will be the prince of thieves." So they have this argument, and, there's no settling. Meanwhile, Apollo has been out checking his herds, and he's noticed this theft. It's driving him nuts, because he went down where the cattle were, and he knows they're gone, and he finds these tracks, and he says, "I can't figure this out. These are not the tracks of leopards or bears or centaurs or humans, or I don't know what this is." And apparently Hermes, when he walks, there's big leaps. He says, there's a track over here and over there. I have no idea what's going on. And then he finds this guy Bottas. He says, "You seen anything?" The guy says, "Nope." He says, "You see a lot of stuff go on this road, some good, some bad." But then he can't restrain himself. He says, "But I did see this weirdest thing. I saw this day-year-old baby with a staff running 50 cattle backwards."
Run it off.
And then out of a cloud comes a big eagle, and Apollo is supposed to be the guy who can read a sign. He knows, when he sees something, he knows what it means. And so part of the joke in this is that Hermes has made a track that Apollo cannot read. There's a little story here about who can make a secret message and who can read the secret message. And Hermes has written a message that Apollo can't read. But when this eagle comes out of the cloud, Apollo does know how to read that, and he understands that this must be a child of Zeus. So he inquires around and stuff, and eventually he ends up in the mountains and finds this cave. And, he comes busting in. No search warrant. At least I think that's what the Greek says. He comes in and he's looking around, and Maya's asleep and the kid's asleep, and he's looking around and he goes all through the house. He opens all these cupboards and he sees all these purple garments and big buckets of ambrosia and stuff, so he understands that he's dealing with some kind of high-powered people. And finally he finds Hermes, and Hermes is I gave you that image yesterday. Hermes is cuddled down in his cradle. He's got the lyre under his armpit, and he's cooing and playing with his knees. He's like the ember in the fire that's buried under the ashes. And Apollo comes up and says, "Okay, I know who you are and what you did." And Hermes says, What? And Apollo picks him up and shakes him and says, tells him those things. He says, 50 of my cattle have been stolen, and there's every indication that you are the perpetrator. Then Hermes says, "I didn't steal any of your cattle." He says, "I'm a day-old baby. I have been lying in my mother's cradle. What I care for is soft blankets and my mother's breasts and baths, warm baths. Look at my little feet. I couldn't go out walking on that rough ground. I didn't steal your cattle, whatever cattle are, because I've only heard of them by hearsay." And then Apollo laughs. at the cheekiness of this kid. He smiles and laughs. And then he tries to get mad again. He says, if you don't tell me what happened, I'm going to throw you down into deepest Tartarus. And you will spend the rest of eternity being the leader of little babies down there. And Hermes at that point cuts a fart. Only the way the Greek says, Hermes let loose a hard-working belly surf. With the portent of worse things to come. So this is like the lower intestine prophecy. And Apollo drops him because Apollo's like Mr. Clean in this story, you know. And just to be in the cave is kind of unsettling for him. And then to have a farting, shitting baby on his hand is kind of beyond him. And one thing that Hermes does is he keeps saying, you know, I didn't steal your cattle. I never herd of cattle. I just want, you know, my mother and everything. But he says, if you think I did, let's go up to Mount Olympus and have this argument in front of my father, and we'll really settle this. He keeps saying that. And sort of he starts walking out of the cave saying, you know, if you really believe, let's go up to Mount Olympus and we'll have this argument up there. So finally Apollo says, okay. So they go up to Mount Olympus where the gods, it's morning, they're all sitting around in the porticos of the gods, they're having their cappuccino. The sun is just coming up, and here comes Apollo and Hermes. And Zeus laughs. He says, what is this? Apollo coming in with a little boy has got the bright face of a newsboy or something, of a herald. Is that some fabulous prize you got in a battle or something? And Apollo says, well, you can make jokes if you want, but this is very serious. This kid stole 50 of my cattle. And Apollo goes through the whole story like a lawyer. You know, he says, stole 50 cattle. I can't find them, but I found these footprints. And we got this guy Bottas. We got a witness. You know, I'm very aggrieved. And he goes on and on and on. They turn to Hermes, and Hermes does exactly the same thing. He says, well, I'm a day old, and I have these very tender feet, and this has been a great trouble to me. He came in, and he threatened me, he shook me, he was going to punch me. If you really are my father, I hope you'll protect me from this bully, and I'm thinking of filing a thing about police brutality, and there's... And then Zeus laughs to see his cheeky son go on with such shamelessness. And then there's a nice moment where Zeus says, okay, boys, knock it off. Hermes, show me where the cattle are. Hermes says, okay. So they go down to the place by the river Alpheus where the cattle are, and they're going to take them back to the herd. And as they're standing there, Apollo notices these hides on the rocks, and he's suddenly very frightened. He thinks, whoa, this is a one-day-old kid, and there's something he's done here, and he's frightened of Hermes' power. And Apollo he has some willow trees grow up, and he tries to catch Hermes because he's scared of him. And Hermes just makes the willow trees fall away. This sibling rivalry goes on a little bit here. Apollo is threatened by Hermes and tries to bind him. But Hermes has the lyre with him. And he says, you know, I don't think you should be mad at me anymore. And he starts to tune up the lyre. He sings a song to Apollo. And what he sings is called a theogony. It's a story of the gods and how each of them came to be and how each of them came to have his or her portion of the universe. And I think this theogony has in it Apollo. He sings, you know, he's seducing Apollo. So he probably sings the story, and it has some praise for Apollo. And I think it also probably has Hermes in it. So he puts himself in the story. And when he's done, Apollo is completely mesmerized. He says, he can't help himself. He says, little boy, butcher of cattle, trickster, thief, that's the most beautiful music I have ever heard. And I'm the guy who helps the muses sing, and I have never heard music like that. He says, where did you learn to play that machine there? And how did you know how to do that? And there's a feeling comes over me that's like a mixture of sexual desire, sleep, and humor. And Hermes says, well, would you like to have the lyre? Apollo says, oh, that would be wonderful. Hermes says, yeah, you look like a guy who could learn to play this quickly. You're a smart guy. I bet you could, and you'll be able to put clear words to this music. And he says, be careful. If you come to this instrument with the right spirit, it will play beautifully. If you come in a hurry, it'll just chatter like birds or something. So he gives the guitar to Apollo, and then Apollo has had these herds and has the herder's staff. And Apollo gives it to Hermes. He says, you take this. It's a cornel with a laurel tree, cornel wood staff. And Hermes makes himself a set of pipes, the pan pipes. He wants to have an instrument still. And then they have this little exchange. What Hermes really wants, actually, is he would like to have the power of prophecy, which Apollo has. Apollo can see into the mind of Zeus. And so Hermes keeps bringing this up. He keeps saying, oh, you're such a wonderful older brother. You know what Zeus can think. You have this wonderful gift, and you're such a wonderful older brother. And after a while, Apollo gets the idea, and he says, well, I understand that you want the art of prophecy, but I can't really give that to you, and that's mine. And he gives him, there's a sort of minor oracle that Hermes gets that has to do with, there are 3 sisters that are like bees, and when they've eaten honey, they speak the truth, and when they're hungry, they don't. They lie and chatter. You go to them to find something out, but of course you don't know if they've eaten or not. And he gives him his other offices. Hermes then becomes the messenger of the gods who goes from heaven to earth, and the guide of souls who takes the dead into the underworld and can bring the souls back from the underworld. He says, this hymn says, Hermes, you will be the guide to Hades, who gives that great gift that nobody can give any return gift for, which is death. And then at the end it says, and so now Hermes is among us, sits among the gods, and is their messenger, though at nighttime he still is a great pest to the race who has to die, which is human beings. That's the end of the story.
Thank you very much.